That evening, Giulia returned home, her mind unsettled by all she had discovered. The truth had shaken her deeply, yet beneath the fear and confusion, there was a growing sense of determination. She had made her choice to reclaim her life and protect the future that awaited her. For Giulia, this was not merely the close of a difficult day, but the end of an entire chapter. The next morning, Sunday, May 28th, 2023, Alessandro arrived at the local police station, accompanied by his mother. Calmly, he told the officers that Giulia was missing. He explained that he had last seen her earlier that morning, still asleep beside him before he left for work. His account seemed ordinary, almost tender, yet those words would mark the start of a mystery that would soon grip the entire nation. In the days that followed, Italy watched in disbelief as the story unfolded, a story that would leave a country stunned, grieving, and searching for answers. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. This is the story of Giulia Tramontano, a young woman whose name would one day be spoken far beyond her hometown, and the truths that came to light in the days that followed her disappearance. It is not only the account of her personal journey, but also a reminder of the fragile balance between trust, hope, and deception. Giulia was born on May 2nd, 1994, in a small town nestled within the province of Naples in southern Italy. She entered the world as the first child of Franco and Lorana, a couple who, like many families in the South, valued togetherness, resilience, and the comforting rhythm of tradition. Over time, Giulia's family grew. She was joined by her younger sister Anna and her brother Mario. Within their home, affection was not scarce. Everyday life revolved around warmth, laughter, and the kind of ordinary joys that make up the foundations of strong family ties. From her earliest days, Giulia was not a child easily overlooked. She stood out because of her gentle but determined nature. Teachers remembered her as a girl who listened carefully, who treated others with kindness, and who carried a sense of responsibility unusual for her age. She was cheerful and independent, yes, but also deeply protective, often stepping into the role of a second mother to her younger siblings. If Anna needed comfort or Mario required help with schoolwork, Giulia was there. It was as though she had been born with an extra portion of maturity, her actions always guided by empathy and sincerity. As she grew, her personality developed in harmony with a budding curiosity about the world around her. Giulia discovered a fascination with architecture and the real estate world, fields that combined her love for aesthetics with a practical vision of helping others find places to call home. Unlike fleeting hobbies, this interest stayed with her, and it became clear that it would guide her professional life. After finishing her secondary education, she chose to continue her studies with dedication and discipline. Those who knew her during this period often recalled her focus. While others might waver in their goals, Giulia's determination remained steady. By the end of 2020, after years of preparation and initial work experiences, Giulia made a decision that reflected both her courage and ambition. She would move to Milan, one of Italy's largest and most dynamic cities. For a young woman raised in a smaller town, this was no small step. Milan represented opportunity, independence, and a chance to build something significant. Her departure was bittersweet for her family, who would miss her daily presence. But they also understood that Giulia's dreams required a wider horizon. Life in Milan began with challenges, but Giulia adapted quickly. She secured work as a real estate agent, a role that allowed her to combine professionalism with her natural charisma. Her persistence, meticulous nature, and approachable personality quickly earned her respect among her colleagues. She was recognized not only for her skill, but also for her sincerity. She treated clients with genuine care, guiding them patiently through one of the most important decisions of their lives. Still, Giulia was not someone who lived for work alone. Beneath her professional determination, she nurtured the simple, hopeful dream of many young women to one day build a loving family of her own. She wished to share her successes and struggles with someone who would value her loyalty and her kind heart. It was during this time that destiny introduced her to a man who would later play a central role in her story, Alessandro Impagnatiello. Their paths first crossed through social media interactions, later strengthened when they met in person during a celebration hosted in a luxury Milanese hotel. Alessandro, born in 1993 in Rome, had been living in Milan for several years. He worked as a barman in some of the city's most exclusive venues, places frequented by professionals, travelers, and those seeking refined experiences. Outgoing and ambitious, Alessandro presented himself as confident, well-mannered, and cultivated. Coming from a hard-working family and having pursued technical studies, he had carved a place for himself in Milan. His image was polished, his words persuasive, and his gestures carefully measured. On the personal side, Alessandro was already the father of a 6-year-old boy from a previous relationship. According to his own accounts, he maintained an amicable relationship with the child's mother, managing to portray himself as a responsible figure. To Giulia, this maturity seemed reassuring. It suggested that Alessandro was capable of commitment and care, values that resonated with her own vision of the future. In the first months of their acquaintance, Alessandro appeared attentive and affectionate. He often wrote warm messages, organized visits, and spoke of future plans. To an outsider, it might have seemed like the beginning of a harmonious love story. Giulia, touched by these gestures, felt her heart opening to him. By November 2021, the bond between them had grown strong enough for the couple to move in together. They settled in an apartment on the first floor of a residential building on the outskirts of Milan. To neighbors and acquaintances, their life appeared calm and stable. They were seen going on short weekend trips, sharing meals, and occasionally posting photographs together on social media. Friends described Giulia as radiant, especially when she spoke about the life she was building. By November 2022, happiness seemed complete. Giulia shared the news that she was expecting a baby. For her, who had always dreamed of motherhood, it was one of the most joyous announcements she had ever made. Her family received the news with tears of happiness, ready to welcome a new life. In those early days, Giulia's hopes soared. She envisioned herself holding her child, guiding him or her with the same care she had once given to her siblings. But as often happens, reality behind closed doors was more complex than appearances. At the start of 2023, Giulia began experiencing discomforts linked to her pregnancy. Natural changes, but ones that left her more vulnerable, both physically and emotionally. It was around this time that small, unsettling patterns in Alessandro's behavior began to surface. He occasionally made jokes that felt cutting rather than playful. He mocked her Neapolitan origins in front of friends, or made sarcastic remarks about the football team she supported. For an outsider, such comments might have seemed trivial, but to Giulia, who cherished respect and loyalty, they cut deeply. More troubling still were the subtle but noticeable changes in Alessandro's overall behavior. At times he seemed distracted, evasive, unwilling to answer questions clearly. He began to stay out late, offering vague explanations about work or friends. His moods shifted quickly, leaving Giulia uncertain of what to expect. Despite these difficulties, Giulia tried to maintain peace within their household. She focused on understanding him, believing that patience and care could restore the harmony they once had. She spoke of the future with hope, reminding herself that she was about to become a mother and that this was the most important responsibility of her life. Yet, beneath her optimism, doubts began to grow, whispering that something in her world was no longer as solid as it appeared. And so, the cracks in the foundation of their relationship widened, quietly foreshadowing the darker days that were soon to come. Giulia held on tightly to the hope that with patience, time, and above all the arrival of their son, already chosen to be named Tiago, her relationship with Alessandro could find new stability. She often told herself that becoming parents might soften his edges, heal the cracks in their bond, and give them both the sense of purpose and unity they seemed to be missing. In her heart, she dreamed of the day she would hold her baby, believing that the miracle of life might change Alessandro's priorities and bring them closer together. On April 14th, 2023, Giulia received a visit from her father, Franco, and her younger brother, Mario. They had traveled from her hometown in Naples to Milan, eager to see her, share a family meal, and also meet Alessandro in person. Giulia carefully prepared a warm lunch, wanting everything to feel harmonious and welcoming. The gathering carried the atmosphere of ordinary family life. Shared stories, laughter around the table, and the natural joy of being together. On the surface, everything seemed fine. But beneath the polite smiles and gestures, the growing tension between Giulia and Alessandro quietly lingered. Family members noticed subtle unease in her demeanor, though she did her best to conceal it. By the end of April, Giulia's unease had deepened into something she could no longer dismiss. She began noticing inconsistencies that troubled her, messages arriving on Alessandro's phone that felt strange, unexplained absences that lasted longer than he admitted, and sudden changes to his daily routine that made little sense. Her intuition, always calm but rarely wrong, whispered to her that something was not as it should be. Her suspicions were confirmed when she was unexpectedly contacted by a young woman named Algra Surarea, just 23 years old, with Italian and English roots. Algra was working as a waitress assistant at the very same hotel where Alessandro had his job. She reached out to Giulia with a revelation that would forever alter her understanding of the man she loved. She had been in a relationship with Alessandro for nearly a year. Their involvement had begun in July 2022, and throughout that time, Alessandro had repeatedly assured her that his relationship with Giulia was over. The reality, however, was far more entangled than either woman initially realized. In February 2023, Algra herself had discovered she was pregnant. After much reflection and a difficult decision, she chose not to continue with the pregnancy, believing she was not prepared for motherhood. Alessandro supported her choice and continued the relationship, convincing her that they were building a future together. What Algra never knew was that Alessandro was still living with Giulia, who was expecting his child and building her life around the promise of a family. The illusion shattered when Algra accidentally discovered photographs of Alessandro with Giulia saved on his phone. In those images, she saw the undeniable truth. She had been deceived. When she confronted Alessandro, he turned to elaborate lies in order to protect himself. He insisted that Giulia's baby was not his, that she was mentally unstable, and even presented a fabricated paternity test that appeared to confirm his claims. His attempt to control the narrative was persuasive on the surface, but Algra's instincts kept her questioning. In May 2023, her doubts turned into certainty. While checking Alessandro's device, she discovered disturbing internet searches on how to forge DNA test documents. At that moment, every last thread of trust broke. Outraged and determined to uncover the full truth, Algra contacted Giulia directly using a number she had found in Alessandro's phone. With a heavy heart, she revealed everything. Their year-long affair, the pregnancy, and the intricate web of lies that Alessandro had spun between them. On May 27th, 2023, the two women arranged to meet in front of a hotel. Their meeting, far from being filled with hostility, unfolded in a spirit of compassion and understanding. For more than an hour, they spoke with raw honesty, exchanging the pain of betrayal but also the strength of solidarity. Surveillance cameras later captured the moment when they embraced each other in a gesture that symbolized empathy rather than rivalry. Both had been manipulated, and both carried the scars of Alessandro's deceit. During that conversation, Giulia confided her decision. She intended to end her relationship with Alessandro and return to her family in Naples. Algra, touched by her courage, offered her a place to stay that very night if she needed it. Giulia, however, declined the offer with quiet determination, explaining that she would return to the apartment she shared with Alessandro one last time before moving forward with her plan. Neither woman could have imagined how consequential that decision would prove to be. That evening, Giulia returned home, shaken by what she had learned but resolute in her choice to reclaim her life. For her, it was the end of a chapter. and she looked ahead to the safety of her family and the future she wished to build for herself and her unborn child. The following day, Sunday, May 28, 2023, Alessandro appeared at a police station, accompanied by his mother. He reported Giulia missing, telling officers that he had last seen her that morning, peacefully asleep in their bed before he left for work. His words marked the beginning of a case that would soon captivate Italy, leaving a nation stunned and searching for answers. Yet even at this early stage, inconsistencies appeared. The version Alessandro initially offered painted Giulia's disappearance as voluntary. He claimed that after a disagreement, he had gone to work, and when he returned, she was gone. According to him, she had taken her phone, her passport, and a sum of cash, suggesting, he said, that she had chosen to leave of her own accord. After filing the missing person report, Alessandro reached out to Giulia's parents by phone. The call struck them like a lightning bolt. They had been attending a joyful family celebration when the message reached them. In an instant, celebration turned into panic. Within hours, they were on the road to Milan, driving through the night with heavy hearts and a sense of dread that words could not describe. Later, they would recall that journey as the longest and most painful of their lives, a desperate race to find their daughter and uncover the truth behind her sudden disappearance. They knew Giulia intimately, and for her family, it was impossible to imagine her vanishing without leaving a word. She was not the kind of person to walk away from her loved ones, let alone in such a vulnerable moment of her life. The thought that she might have chosen to disappear on her own simply did not match the woman they knew. As the hours passed without a message, without a sign, their dread grew heavier. If Giulia had not left intentionally, then something far more troubling must have happened. That same night, unable to remain passive, Giulia's sister reached out to a well-known television program that specialized in tracing missing people. These shows had often brought critical public attention to delicate cases, and the family hoped that by sharing Giulia's story, someone might come forward with information, or at the very least, the media spotlight could accelerate the search. By 8:30 the following morning, Giulia's parents were already at the police station, their exhaustion visible after a sleepless night. They pleaded for answers, for action, for reassurance. The station commander received them with empathy, promising that every possible resource would be used to find their daughter. He tried to soothe them with cautious optimism, but behind the scenes, investigators were beginning to notice subtle but significant inconsistencies in Alessandro's statements. His timelines shifted depending on the question. His descriptions of the previous day contained gaps. These contradictions were enough to activate the full disappearance protocol, turning the case into a priority. Very quickly, the story attracted the attention of journalists and reporters. A young woman, 7 months pregnant, missing under sudden and troubling circumstances. Such a story could not remain in the shadows. Within hours, local media carried headlines and TV broadcasts appealed to the public for help. Friends of Giulia were quick to step forward as well. They emphasized her responsible character, her devotion to her family, and her excitement about becoming a mother. In their eyes, the suggestion that she had chosen to leave everything behind was unthinkable. From that moment on, the focus of the investigation shifted sharply toward Alessandro. Detectives began carefully analyzing every aspect of his movements and environment. When they examined his vehicle, they found small but telling traces. Faint spots of blood inside the car. Samples were rushed to forensic labs, where rapid analysis confirmed the worst suspicion. The blood was compatible with Giulia's. This was no random coincidence. Adding to the unease was a persistent odor of gasoline detected in the trunk, a detail Alessandro could not convincingly explain. To the trained eyes of investigators, these were not meaningless anomalies. They were signs that demanded deeper scrutiny. Interviews with neighbors added further layers to the picture. Several testified that, in the weeks before Giulia's disappearance, they had overheard heated arguments and loud quarrels coming from the couple's apartment. Disturbances hinted at a relationship far less peaceful than the smiling photos the couple had posted on social media. The contrast between the public image and the private reality raised new questions about what had been happening behind closed doors. The police searched the apartment thoroughly. There, on the stairs and in the hallway, they noticed faint reddish stains, subtle marks that might have been overlooked by an untrained eye. While not overwhelming in themselves, these traces, when combined with the car evidence, the gasoline smell, and Alessandro's shifting stories, tipped the balance. What had begun as a missing person case was slowly taking the shape of something far more serious. What unsettled detectives even more was Alessandro's attitude in the days that followed Giulia's disappearance. While her family and friends mobilized search groups, shared appeals on social media, and organized vigils, Alessandro seemed strangely detached. He completed the necessary formalities at the station. But beyond that, his participation was minimal. He did not join the physical search parties combing through neighborhoods and parks. He did not post heartfelt appeals online. His expressions of worry were restrained, almost mechanical. Investigators later noted that his emotional distance stood out as highly unusual for someone in his position. The real breakthrough came when detectives gained access to Alessandro's digital devices: his phone, tablet, and computer. What they found in the cached searches and browsing history was deeply disturbing. Long before Giulia's disappearance, there were records of online queries about poisons, the effects of toxic substances, and methods that could harm a person without leaving visible signs. These were not vague or accidental searches. They were deliberate, repeated, and specific. Dated months earlier, they revealed a disturbing preoccupation that investigators could not ignore. This evidence alone gave them probable cause to escalate the case from a disappearance to a criminal investigation. But the discoveries did not stop there. Digging deeper, detectives found Alessandro had not only researched general information about toxins, he had also looked into why certain substances might fail to work as intended. This detail gave the impression of someone studying, planning, even testing, a level of forethought that removed any doubt about the seriousness of the situation. In parallel, experts re-examined the DNA test document that Alessandro had once shown to Algra, the other woman entangled in his life. What appeared at first glance to be a professional medical report turned out, under forensic analysis, to be a forgery. Specialists confirmed that it had been altered and manipulated in order to sustain his deception. This revelation not only discredited Alessandro's previous claims, but also reinforced the pattern of calculated dishonesty that was emerging around him. Taken together, the forensics in the car, the unexplained gasoline odor, the faint stains in the apartment, the testimony of neighbors, the inconsistencies in Alessandro's version of events, the troubling online searches, and the falsified DNA test. The investigation had moved well beyond suspicion. Another crucial breakthrough came when investigators reviewed Alessandro's movements in the critical days following Giulia's disappearance. The city of Milan, like many metropolitan areas, is covered by an extensive network of security cameras that silently observe the comings and goings of daily life. Detectives painstakingly traced his route through this digital web of surveillance, connecting one fragment of footage to the next until they had a nearly complete picture of his activities. What they saw was striking. Alessandro moved across the city with unsettling calm, as though nothing unusual had happened. His demeanor was not that of a man in distress or grief, but of someone going about his routine. Even more troubling, cameras recorded him entering a garage several times, often carrying large black plastic bags. Each time he emerged, however, he was empty-handed. These repeated trips raised immediate red flags, suggesting that the garage was more than an ordinary storage space. It was part of a secret he was desperately trying to conceal. Faced with this growing body of evidence, investigators decided the time for polite questioning had passed. Alessandro was formally detained and interrogated. At first, he maintained his usual composure, clinging stubbornly to his original version of events. He insisted that he knew nothing of Giulia's fate and repeated the claim that she had left voluntarily. But as detectives laid out the inconsistencies, one piece of evidence after another, the weight of proof pressed in on him. Each detail eroded the credibility of his story. Finally, in the long hours between May 31st and June 1st, 2023, Alessandro's defenses collapsed. Under the pressure of relentless questioning and undeniable facts, he confessed. He admitted to ending Giulia's life and provided investigators with precise directions on where she could be found. Following his instructions, detectives searched the garage he had been recorded visiting. In the basement level, they made the heartbreaking discovery. Giulia, only a short distance from the very apartment she had shared with him, hidden away in silence. The confirmation of her fate sent shockwaves through her family, her community, and eventually the entire country. Alessandro was arrested immediately and transferred to prison under heavy guard. The news spread quickly, dominating headlines and igniting public outrage. Across Italy, people mourned the loss of a young woman whose story had captured hearts and whose future had been cut short. Meanwhile, forensic experts began their meticulous work. A detailed autopsy and toxicological analysis revealed unsettling truths. Tests confirmed the presence of toxic substances in Giulia's system, consistent with suspicions that she had been poisoned repeatedly in the weeks leading up to her death. This finding transformed the narrative. Giulia had not only been betrayed in life, but had also endured a deliberate campaign to weaken her health long before the final night. In order to better understand the man responsible, the court ordered a psychological evaluation of Alessandro. The assessment painted a disturbing portrait. Experts noted pronounced narcissistic traits, a profound inability to empathize, and a deeply rooted egocentrism. In the eyes of professionals, Alessandro presented as manipulative, calculating, and cold, someone who viewed other human beings not as partners or equals, but as instruments to serve his own desires. During interrogations and early court appearances, this was confirmed. He showed little visible remorse, speaking of events with detachment, as though he were recounting details of a stranger's life rather than his own actions. Through both his confession and the detailed reconstruction provided by investigators, the timeline of events became clearer. The planning had not been impulsive. As early as December 12th, 2022, just days after Giulia had shared the joyous news of her pregnancy, Alessandro had begun researching poisons online. From that moment until May 2023, he refined his methods, moving forward with chilling patience while simultaneously continuing his secret relationship with Algra, the other woman entangled in his double life. During those months, Giulia unknowingly ingested toxic substances that steadily undermined her health. Her unexplained fatigue and discomfort, which she had attributed to pregnancy, were in fact symptoms of something far more sinister. The final chapter of her life unfolded on May 27, 2023. That evening, at 9:43 p.m., Giulia sent what would become her last message to her mother. In it, she reassured her family that she was resting and that everything was fine. It was a message filled with the warmth and responsibility that had always defined her. But shortly after sending it, her phone fell silent forever. According to judicial reconstruction, earlier that same evening, Giulia had returned home around 7 p.m. after meeting with Algra. Inside the apartment, Alessandro tried one last time to persuade her to stay, but Giulia was resolute. She told him she would return to Naples with her family and that he would no longer be part of her or her baby's future. These words struck at the core of his pride and control. As Giulia quietly prepared dinner, choosing calm over conflict, Alessandro's restraint shattered. Afterward, in a state of panic, he attempted a clumsy cover-up. Returning to the apartment, he tried to clean traces of DNA from the sofa and other surfaces. He disposed of Giulia's phone by dropping it into a sewer, but not before sending misleading replies to her loved ones, pretending to be her in order to buy himself time. His attempts were desperate and inconsistent, leaving behind a trail of evidence that investigators would later piece together. The legal process began on January 18, 2024, under immense public scrutiny. Alessandro was formally charged with aggravated murder, cruelty, and violation of cohabitation obligations. Over the span of 10 months, the trial unfolded across 13 separate hearings. Prosecutors meticulously reconstructed every phase of the crime, from the months of planning to the poisoning to the final act and the attempt at concealment. Throughout the hearings, Alessandro attempted to minimize his responsibility, presenting himself as confused and detached from the very events he had caused. He claimed that he could not even recall the exact sequence of what happened until he later saw the reports in the media. His legal defense attempted to shape the narrative into one of impulse, an act of sudden rage that had erupted without forethought. According to this version, Alessandro was not a planner but a man overcome by uncontrollable emotion. Yet, as the prosecutors methodically laid out their case, this defense unraveled. The evidence was too consistent, too overwhelming. The searches for poisons, the falsified DNA test, the staged alibis, and the long months of calculated behavior painted a very different portrait. Far from impulsive, the act bore all the hallmarks of premeditation and manipulation. Each hearing only deepened this impression. For Giulia's family, attending the trial was like reopening a wound again and again. Yet they remained present at every session, a symbol of resilience and love, determined that Giulia's memory would not be reduced to a case file. On November 11, 2024, prosecutors stood before the court and delivered their final request: life imprisonment with 18 months of solitary confinement. They described Alessandro as a man consumed by narcissism, a manipulative figure who built his life on lies, and a person who displayed no genuine remorse. In their words, he had treated Giulia not as a partner or as the mother of his unborn child, but as an obstacle to be removed in order to preserve his double life. Their statement was firm. Society needed protection from such an individual. 2 weeks later, on November 25, 2024, the court returned with its verdict. Alessandro was sentenced to life imprisonment with an additional 3 months of solitary confinement. The panel of judges confirmed the presence of aggravating factors: cruelty, abusive cohabitation, and the calculated planning of his actions. Alongside the prison sentence, Alessandro was ordered to pay 700,000 euros in compensation to Giulia's family, 200,000 euros each to her parents, and 150,000 euros each to her siblings. This financial penalty was not intended as consolation for their loss, but rather as recognition of the immense moral and emotional harm they had suffered. The scene inside the courtroom was deeply emotional. While Alessandro sat unmoved, his face expressionless, Giulia's family wept and embraced each other. Court officials, moved by the case, handed the grieving family a bouquet of white roses accompanied by a note that read, "A thought for Giulia." For many who witnessed it, that moment symbolized not only grief, but also the dignity of a young woman whose life had been cut short. Legal proceedings continued into the following year. On June 25, 2025, the appellate court confirmed Alessandro's life sentence. The appeal process slightly altered the ruling by removing the aggravating factor specifically related to premeditation in the poisoning, but the essence of the judgment remained unchanged. Alessandro would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For Giulia's family, this confirmation was bittersweet. Justice had been upheld, yet nothing could restore the daughter, sister, and mother-to-be they had lost. Weeks later, the investigation reached a critical turning point. During the routine cleanup of an abandoned property near a stretch of old railroad tracks, a crew of construction workers made a chilling discovery. While clearing debris, one of them noticed a few strands of blonde hair tangled in the dirt and immediately feared the worst. It was Chelsea. News of the discovery spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the community. Family, friends, and neighbors who had clung so tightly to hope were suddenly confronted with the unbearable truth. The purple ribbons that had once adorned lampposts, symbols of faith and unity, now carried a new, heartbreaking meaning. For months, many had refused to accept the idea that something terrible had happened. They convinced themselves that Chelsea might still walk through her front door one day, smiling as if nothing had changed. But that final discovery shattered the illusion completely, extinguishing the last fragile ember of hope that had survived for so long. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. The quiet village of Maybe, Michigan, sat tucked away among farmland and open skies. Life there moved at a slower rhythm, and in 2014, it was home to a young woman whose spirit left an impression on nearly everyone she encountered. Her name was Chelsea Ellen Bruck, just 22 years old, full of optimism, and still building the life she dreamed of. Chelsea lived on her family's 160-acre farm, a place that had shaped much of her upbringing. Friends and relatives remembered her as someone who carried an unmistakable warmth. She had a smile that seemed to reach her eyes, and behind that smile was a sense of humor and lightheartedness that could brighten even an ordinary day. While she was sometimes reserved when meeting new people, those who spent time with her quickly discovered her playfulness and her lively social nature. Chelsea was known for her jokes, her ability to make others laugh, and her glass-half-full approach to life. Chelsea's family was the heart of her world. The youngest of 5 siblings, she and her sisters shared a particularly close bond, proudly calling themselves the Bruck girls. They supported one another through every stage of life, creating memories that were filled with laughter, traditions, and the comfort of knowing someone always had your back. Work was also an important part of Chelsea's identity. She had been employed for 4 years as a hostess at Olga's Kitchen, a popular restaurant where she greeted customers with the same kindness she shared with friends. Outside of work, her life was rich with interests. Chelsea enjoyed musical soundtracks, played video games, and could often be found curled up with a good book. She also loved to bake, experimenting with recipes in the kitchen. Food, in fact, was her deepest passion. She had big plans for her future. She hoped to pursue a culinary degree at college, with dreams of turning her enthusiasm for cooking into a career she could build for herself. As autumn settled over Michigan, so too came the Halloween season, and with it, the excitement of festivities. On the night of October 26, 2014, Frenchtown Township, about 15 minutes from Maybe, was buzzing with anticipation. That evening, musician Mike Williams, lead singer of the local rock band Pickaxe Preacher, was hosting his annual Halloween party. To call it a party was almost an understatement. It had grown into something resembling a small festival, attracting hundreds of attendees. Mike's property was expansive, and in preparation for the event, he had even arranged for hired security and parking attendants. Yet even with these precautions, no one could have predicted just how enormous the gathering would become. By the end of the night, more than 600 people had come and gone, a number larger than the entire population of Maybe itself. For Chelsea and her friends, this was the kind of night they had been eagerly anticipating. The party promised music, fun, and a chance to show off their costumes. Chelsea had poured time and creativity into designing her outfit, a homemade poison ivy costume inspired by the famous comic book character. She arrived at the event with her best friend Rebecca, ready for an evening of fun. By around 1:30 a.m., Chelsea posed for a photo. In that single frame, her happiness was evident, her smile bright, her costume vibrant, her energy alive. In her hand, she held a bottle with a poison label taped to it, which friends later said had been filled with inexpensive wine. Accounts of her night vary depending on who recalls it. Some guests said Chelsea seemed to be drinking more heavily, while others believed she was pacing herself and wasn't out of control. The truth is hazy, as it often is at large parties where memories blur with music and movement. At one point, a couple of people remembered her accidentally walking into a wooden post, leaving a small cut on her forehead. Afterward, she reportedly began asking friends if they could give her a ride home. Complicating matters, Chelsea had left her phone in Rebecca's car because her costume had no pockets. When Rebecca went to retrieve it for her, she told Chelsea to stay put until she got back. But when she returned moments later, Chelsea was no longer in the spot where she had been waiting. From that moment on, Rebecca did not see her again. Another friend, who had also promised her a ride home, tried searching for her too, but had no luck. With hundreds of people on the property, music still blasting, and groups constantly shifting, it wasn't unusual to lose sight of someone in the crowd. It was easy for friends to assume that Chelsea had simply left with others she knew. The party itself was considered a success. Guests danced, talked, and celebrated deep into the night. As dawn approached and the last stragglers headed home, many with hangovers in tow, the event seemed to be nothing more than a typical night of youthful fun. But while others slept off the long hours of celebration, Chelsea's family woke to a different reality. Morning came, and she had not returned home. Her bedroom remained untouched. Her phone was not with her. Unease quickly grew into concern, and when it became clear that Chelsea was not simply staying at a friend's place, the police were called. Chelsea was officially reported missing, and detectives immediately traced her last known whereabouts to Mike Williams's property. Driving out there, investigators noted how isolated the location was. Frenchtown Township's rural setting meant that walking home was nearly impossible unless you lived close by. Roads were long, winding, and surrounded by fields. For Chelsea, whose home was approximately 8 miles away, the only realistic way to leave the party was in someone's car. When detectives arrived, the aftermath of the night was obvious. The house and yard bore the remnants of hundreds of guests. Empty bottles and cans were scattered across the ground. The remains of a bonfire still smoked faintly in the cool morning air. What had been a night of celebration now took on a far more somber tone, as this would become the last confirmed place Chelsea was seen. When suspicion fell on Mike, he openly admitted, almost in disbelief, that he had never met Chelsea before that night and had no idea she was at his party. That fact alone revealed the sheer size and chaos of the event. It had been the kind of party where you could wander through crowded rooms, noisy hallways, and even the yard outside for hours without crossing paths with the same person twice. Strangers flowed in and out, some staying only briefly, others lingering long into the night. By the time news of what had happened began to spread, Mike was left devastated. He insisted that even though he hadn't known her personally, he felt a crushing responsibility. Despite the wave of negative attention and harsh publicity he received after the party, he tried in every way he could to cooperate with law enforcement and with the search for answers. The investigation quickly escalated into one of the largest the area had seen in years. K-9 search units, state-of-the-art drones, and helicopters circled overhead, while hundreds of volunteers and officers carefully scoured every inch of Mike's house, his property, and the fields beyond. The scale of the operation made it clear to everyone involved that this was going to be a long, painstaking process. Investigators faced a wall of challenges from the start. Many attendees had shown up in elaborate costumes or concealing masks, making it nearly impossible to establish an accurate account of who was even present, much less what they had been doing. Monroe County Sheriff Dale Malone explained the difficulty bluntly in a press briefing. Almost everyone they interviewed had been drinking heavily. Witnesses who genuinely wanted to help struggled to recall even the most basic details, their memories distorted by the haze of the night. Others, in their attempts to be helpful, unintentionally mixed up times, places, or people, adding layers of confusion. A few fragments of information surfaced, but none provided solid ground. Some witnesses claimed they had seen Chelsea outside, crying as she worried aloud about how she would get home safely. Another individual reported spotting her leaving at approximately 3 a.m., accompanied by a man dressed in a dark hoodie, heavy glasses, and with a distinctive side-swept fringe. But whether this sighting was accurate or just another misremembered detail, no one could say for sure. Investigators eventually released a sketch of the man, hoping it would spark recognition, though even that added more questions than answers. The case was further muddled by fabricated stories. A partygoer named Harlan Bird gave a dramatic account, claiming he had personally helped Chelsea after she was harassed by 2 men and that she left in their vehicle. His story, detailed and convincing on the surface, collapsed under scrutiny when investigators discovered it was entirely invented. For reasons no one could fully understand, he had made the whole thing up, leading to his eventual arrest. Another false lead came from a woman named Carrie, who told officers that her abusive boyfriend had confessed to ending Chelsea's life that night. But her story, too, unraveled and was exposed as a deliberate fabrication meant to frame her ex-partner. She, like Bird, was charged for lying to investigators. Each false story wasted critical time and resources, and each one deepened the frustration of those desperately seeking the truth. Still, the search for Chelsea only grew in determination. A Facebook page titled, "Help Find Chelsea Bruck" quickly amassed more than 12,000 members, with posts, shares, and comments spreading far beyond state lines. The community came together in an extraordinary way. Volunteers handed out leaflets, placed posters in storefronts, and even coordinated across borders. More than 1 million flyers featuring Chelsea's smiling face were distributed, reaching into neighboring countries in the hope that someone, somewhere, might know something. A reward fund also grew steadily, further driving tips, though many led to dead ends. As the months passed, milestones that should have been joyous instead turned heavy with grief. Chelsea's 23rd birthday came and went without her. Her sister's wedding took place with a noticeable, painful emptiness where Chelsea should have stood. The family pressed forward with strength and hope, but every gathering was a reminder of her absence. Then, finally, came the first tangible clues. A red shoe was discovered in a field just a couple of miles away from the party site. It was confirmed to belong to Chelsea. 6 months after her disappearance, another breakthrough arrived when part of her poison ivy costume was located at an industrial site. But with that discovery came chilling evidence. Traces of Chelsea's blood were found, along with DNA from an unidentified man. Investigators noted with unease that the clothing was discovered not far from the home of Harlan Bird's grandmother. Given Bird's earlier lies, suspicion briefly reignited. He was questioned again, subjected to a polygraph test, and asked for a DNA sample. The results, however, cleared him. He passed the polygraph, and his DNA did not match the profile on the costume. Despite the eerie coincidence, police concluded it was nothing more than that: a coincidence. Weeks later, the investigation reached its turning point. Construction workers, clearing an abandoned property near a set of old railroad tracks, unearthed human. One worker spotted strands of blonde hair and instantly suspected the worst. It was Chelsea. The news spread quickly, devastating family, friends, and the wider community who had clung to hope for so long. Purple ribbons that had been tied around lampposts as symbols of hope suddenly took on a new, heartbreaking meaning. For months, many had refused to believe the worst, convincing themselves that Chelsea might still return home. That final discovery extinguished the last ember of that hope. The site where she was found lay about 10 miles from the party. The medical examiner later determined that she had died from trauma to the head, inflicted with a blunt object. Though the conclusion provided answers, it also left behind an aching void of new questions. Chief among them, who was responsible and why? It had now been over a year since Chelsea had vanished, and by this point the search had shifted from an urgent rescue mission into a much broader, methodical investigation. What had once been about trying to bring her home safely had become an exhausting pursuit of answers, filled with dead ends, endless leads, and questions that only multiplied. Detectives, investigators, and volunteers had poured countless hours into the case. Over 1,000 individual tips had been logged, 800 separate interviews conducted, 34 search warrants issued, 14 subpoenas executed, and no fewer than 50 different law enforcement agencies had played some role in the investigation. Despite the scale of this operation, the appeals to the public continued, as officers held out hope that one overlooked witness or one forgotten detail might unlock the truth. It was during this phase of renewed effort that investigators began to focus on a new potential person of interest. They had long been chasing scattered clues, but now the man whose DNA had been found on Chelsea's costume was about to step right into the hands of law enforcement. That man was 27-year-old Daniel Clay. Clay already had a lengthy criminal record stretching back years. His prior convictions included theft, breaking and entering, assault, and even charges of resisting or assaulting a police officer. He was well known to local authorities, the type of individual whose name regularly appeared in police reports. His downfall, however, came in an unexpected way. Daniel had been arrested for something seemingly minor, stealing another person's backpack. Under a new state law, individuals arrested for certain offenses were required to provide DNA samples. When his DNA profile was entered into the system, investigators received the breakthrough they had been waiting for. It was a direct match to the DNA discovered on Chelsea's poison ivy costume. At nearly the same time, a woman had reported being attacked by Daniel in an apartment complex, an incident that had occurred just 1 month before investigators made the DNA connection. The pattern of behavior was becoming harder to ignore. When Daniel was brought into the station for questioning, detectives wasted no time confronting him. They asked about his whereabouts on the night Chelsea went missing. He acknowledged he knew her face, having seen the news coverage, but denied ever meeting her in person. Detectives pressed him harder, finally revealing that his DNA had been recovered from her clothing. Clay insisted it was impossible. but detectives knew what the science told them. DNA doesn't lie. As the hours stretched on, investigators pushed him further. They told him they were past the point of listening to denials. There was no room left for pretending. They needed the truth. Finally, under pressure, Clay began to shift his story. He claimed that on the night of the Halloween party, he had been drinking heavily. In that state, he explained, he set off in his car and passed Chelsea walking by the side of the road. According to his version of events, he offered her a ride. He described her, in his own words, as freaky, a term he never clarified, but which detectives later viewed as dismissive and evasive. He then said that at some point during the ride, she suddenly stopped breathing. Panicking, he claimed he attempted to give her artificial respiration but was unsuccessful. Terrified and in shock, he said he drove aimlessly for 30 to 45 minutes, not knowing what to do. In the end, he admitted that he brought her to a wooded area near railroad tracks about 10 miles from the party, where he left both her and the items that might connect him to her disappearance. It was this account that led to his first formal charge, second-degree murder. Clay's history made the situation even more concerning. With 10 previous arrests on his record, the revelations seemed to confirm a dangerous pattern. From jail, he reportedly told his girlfriend Kelly that he had picked up Chelsea after the party. In his version of events to her, as with the police, he insisted it had been a tragic accident. Still, the consistency of his confessions painted a clear picture for investigators. As evidence grew, more details came to light. Sources revealed that some of Chelsea's belongings had been recovered inside Clay's home. In court, the emotional weight of the proceedings was palpable. Chelsea's family filled the front row of the gallery, sitting just a few feet away from Clay. Witnesses described the raw frustration and anger among the crowd, emotions that spilled into quiet outbursts as family and community members confronted the man accused of stealing Chelsea's future. Clay's girlfriend Kelly again testified that he had called her from jail, repeating his story of an accidental death. He begged for understanding, but investigators saw it as yet another attempt to soften responsibility. His former partner Jessica, the mother of his child, also added to the narrative. Jessica revealed that she had actually worked with Chelsea in the past. She had never heard Daniel mention her name in the months following Chelsea's disappearance. But on the day of his arrest, she received 2 voicemails from him. In them, Daniel's tone was panicked and resigned. He apologized repeatedly, admitted he had messed up badly, and told her that he was going away for a very long time. Despite these confessions, Clay entered a plea of not guilty. Prosecutors, however, were not satisfied with the initial charges. His case escalated quickly. In addition to 1 count of concealment of a body, his charge was upgraded from second-degree murder to open murder. In Michigan law, open murder is a unique category that allows prosecutors to bring a homicide case without specifying whether it is first or second degree. This meant that the final determination of his culpability and the degree of severity would rest in the hands of the jury or the judge. By the spring of 2017, the case that had haunted an entire community was finally entering its most pivotal chapter: the trial of Daniel Clay. Nearly 2.5 years had passed since the night Chelsea vanished from that Halloween gathering, leaving behind a trail of confusion, fear, and unanswered questions. The small Michigan town that once buzzed with Halloween laughter now held its breath, waiting for justice to take its course. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, the public eager yet uneasy, knowing this trial would reopen wounds that had never fully healed. Inside the courtroom, forensic experts took the stand one by one, their testimonies painting a methodical, scientific picture of what they had recovered alongside Chelsea. Her costume, the one she had so excitedly worn that night, was still mostly intact, but investigators noted key areas of concern. The area around the neck and one of the straps, both had signs of damage. These were not just fabric tears. They were potential clues in a puzzle that investigators had spent years piecing together. Forensic testing confirmed that Daniel Clay's DNA was present not only on the clothing, but also on the wig Chelsea had worn that evening. The courtroom fell into a hush as experts described their process in calm, clinical terms. Yet every word carried weight. DNA, the invisible witness, had spoken. But what made the trial even more complex was the introduction of a new emotional layer. Jessica, the mother of Clay's child, emerged as a crucial witness. In a surprising twist, it was revealed that she had also been at the same Halloween party where Chelsea was last seen alive. Now, years later, she stood before the jury, testifying for the prosecution. Her presence added a human dimension to the evidence, a voice from Clay's personal life now standing in opposition to him. Jessica's testimony, paired with the mounting forensic evidence, painted a picture that prosecutors described as both tragic and chilling. As the trial progressed, the prosecution sought to reconstruct the final hours of that Halloween night. Through a combination of witness statements, expert opinions, and timeline analysis, they presented a version of events that they believed reflected what truly happened. They argued that Chelsea, young and full of life, had been vulnerable and alone after the party, stranded without her phone, trying to find a way home in the early morning hours. They suggested that Daniel Clay had offered her a ride, appearing to be a helpful acquaintance, someone extending a simple act of kindness. But prosecutors claimed that not long after she stepped into his car, that gesture of goodwill took a darker turn. To the jury, the prosecution's theory was clear. Chelsea's trust had been misplaced. What began as a ride home ended in tragedy. The medical examiner then took the stand, facing the jury with years of professional composure but clear emotional gravity. Time had complicated her work. Environmental exposure had made the task of determining cause of death extraordinarily difficult. Yet even with those limitations, her conclusion carried conviction. She stated that she was 99.9% confident that Chelsea's death was the result of foul play, not an accident or natural cause. Her phrasing, both scientific and decisive, echoed through the courtroom. The jury listened intently, their faces shifting between disbelief and sorrow. Every sentence seemed to tighten the invisible cord of tension running through the room. Finally, Daniel Clay himself took the stand. It was his chance to speak directly to the jury, to the families, and to the world that had already begun forming its own opinions. Calm at first, he described his version of that night, a story in which he insisted that what happened had not been something he intended. He acknowledged being with Chelsea but denied any malicious intent. But under cross-examination, the tone shifted dramatically. Prosecutors pressed him on every detail, highlighting inconsistencies and pointing out that his story clashed with the physical and forensic evidence. Each question seemed to corner him further. The courtroom grew silent except for the sharp exchange between Clay and the prosecution, a verbal duel where every word mattered. What no one in the courtroom could deny, what stood as a cold and indisputable truth, was that Chelsea's young life had been cut short as a direct result of Daniel Clay's actions. The defense, the prosecution, the judge, and even Daniel himself were in reluctant agreement on that single point. He had already admitted that he was responsible for her death. But the trial was not about whether he caused it. It was about why it happened, and how it happened. The heart of the case rested on one piercing question. Was Chelsea's death deliberate, or was it, as Daniel claimed, an unthinkable accident born out of panic and poor choices? The courtroom atmosphere during those final days was electric, charged with a quiet dread that hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Every person in attendance, family members, reporters, strangers, and jurors, understood that they were witnessing the closing moments of a tragedy that had haunted their community for years. When the time came for deliberations, the jury left the room in a heavy silence, burdened by the weight of human judgment. They deliberated for only a few hours, but for those waiting, it felt like days. Then at last, the jury returned. The air inside the courtroom seemed to freeze. As the foreperson rose to read the verdict, the only sound was the faint rustling of paper. The verdict came out clear and echoing. Daniel Clay was guilty. Specifically, guilty of felony murder in the death of Chelsea Bruck. The words seemed to reverberate through the chamber, bouncing off the wooden benches and walls. For the prosecution, it was the outcome they had sought from the very beginning, a validation of every hour spent building their case and a firm rejection of Daniel's attempts to describe the event as a tragic misstep rather than a crime. The jury had been presented with multiple legal paths. They could have chosen manslaughter if they had believed Daniel's story, that Chelsea's death had been accidental. They could have lowered the charge, allowing for leniency. But they did not. Instead, they concluded that Chelsea's death had occurred during the commission of another felony, and therefore could not be viewed as an unfortunate mishap. Their decision placed Daniel Clay's actions squarely within the boundaries of first-degree felony murder, the most serious classification under the law. When the clerk began to read the list of charges and verdicts, the tension in the courtroom reached a breaking point. For a brief moment, when the words "not guilty" were read in relation to a lesser count, a collective gasp swept through the audience, an instinctive, audible intake of breath. It was as though the entire room had been suspended in a single heartbeat. But then, when the final pronouncement of guilty was read aloud, that silence shattered into an outpouring of raw emotion. Grief, relief, disbelief, and quiet satisfaction all mixed together. Some wept silently. Others closed their eyes, whispering words of thanks or prayer. Justice, though imperfect and heavy, had been served. When it came time for sentencing, the courtroom filled once more. Reporters lined the walls, their cameras silent out of respect. Family members of both the victim and the defendant sat only feet apart, divided not just by rows of benches, but by the irreversible choices of one man. Then Chelsea's mother, Leandra Bruck, stepped forward. She wore a simple purple blouse, Chelsea's favorite color, and a small Crime Stoppers pin bearing her daughter's smiling face. The symbolism was unmistakable. She stood there not only as a grieving mother, but as a voice for her daughter and for every family who had endured such loss. When she turned to face Daniel Clay, the room held its breath. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of years of sorrow. She told him she forgave him. Those words, simple yet monumental, seemed to ripple through the courtroom. Forgiveness, she explained, did not mean forgetting or excusing what had happened. It was not an act of mercy for Daniel, but a necessary act of healing for herself and her family. She handed him a Bible, a gesture of compassion few could have expected. "I can't hold on to anger anymore," she said softly. "It doesn't bring her back. But I can choose peace." Daniel Clay sat motionless, his expression unreadable. He neither cried nor spoke. Perhaps he was lost in thought, or perhaps there was nothing left to say. The silence that followed her words was as profound as any verdict. Before stepping down, Leandra addressed the public directly, speaking not as a grieving parent, but as a mother determined to prevent others from enduring the same fate. Her voice grew stronger as she urged young people to watch out for one another, especially in social settings. "If you go somewhere, anywhere, as a group," she said, "please leave as that same group. Don't assume everyone will be okay. Don't walk away without making sure your friends are safe." We still expect her to walk in the back door. Her plea became a message of awareness and responsibility, a legacy born from unspeakable pain. When the time came for the judge to speak, the room fell quiet once again. The judge fixed his eyes on Daniel Clay, his tone unwavering and direct. "It's very clear to me, Mr. Clay," he said, his words measured yet cutting. "You're a liar and you're a killer." With those words, he handed down the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Chelsea Bruck. But that was not the end of Daniel Clay's punishment. The court also sentenced him to an additional 40 to 75 years in prison for a previous attack on another woman, an assault that had taken place just months before his DNA linked him to Chelsea's case. The judge described that earlier crime as degrading, dehumanizing, and cruel, condemning not only the act, but the pattern of behavior it revealed. "Mr. Clay," the judge said again, "you are a predator. You are a liar." In the weeks that followed, Daniel Clay appealed his conviction, seeking to overturn the jury's decision. But his efforts were in vain. The appeals court reviewed the evidence and the proceedings and upheld the original verdict. There would be no second chance, no retrial, no reduction of sentence. Daniel Clay would spend the remainder of his life behind prison walls. In the midst of this grief, The Bruck family chose to create something positive in Chelsea's memory. A scholarship was established in her name within the culinary arts program at Monroe County Community College, the very program Chelsea had hoped to attend. Through this, her name lives on, tied to the dreams and futures of other young students pursuing their passion. As the story of Chelsea Bruck's case closed in the courtroom, the echoes of her life lingered in the community. What had begun as a night of laughter, friends, and costumes, a Halloween party like any other, ended with a tragedy that no one could have imagined. Her last night was meant to be filled with fun and imagination, but instead it became a chilling reminder of the dangers that sometimes hide in plain sight. Chelsea's story is one that underscores the importance of vigilance, of looking out for one another, and of remembering that the most frightening figures are not always those in masks or costumes. Sometimes, as her case revealed, the real danger comes from those who appear ordinary until the mask slips and the nightmare becomes real. December 16th, 2022, Minnesota. It was still dark outside, just after 5:30 in the morning, when the duty station received a call. On the line was a man. His voice was tense, but it carried no outright panic. Controlled, yet uneasy. He explained that he was inside the apartment of his girlfriend, Alex Pennig. He said he had just heard a gunshot and was trying to get through a locked door. The dispatcher began asking the standard set of questions, attempting to piece together the situation. The man's answers, however, were scattered and inconsistent. At one point, he said that Alex had locked herself in the bathroom. Then, moments later, he added that he had broken down the door and found her lying inside. According to him, there was a gun on the floor next to her. Within minutes, both police officers and paramedics arrived at the scene. The address led them to an ordinary, unremarkable apartment within a multi-unit building. Nothing about the exterior suggested the tragedy waiting inside. When they entered the bathroom, the scene was clear. She was no longer alive. Every crime has its own story, and we're here to tell it to you, our dear viewers. Like, comment, and subscribe. Stay with us. Alexandra Pennig, whom everyone close to her affectionately called Alex, was one of those rare people about whom others would say, she was born to help. From childhood onward, this impression followed her. She was blonde, with lively, almost searching eyes and a smile that seemed to light up even the grayest of days. She carried an air of maturity that exceeded her years, not in physical appearance, but in the way she carried herself and how she interacted with the world around her. There was an unmistakable depth within her, a capacity to listen without interrupting, to sit in silence when words were too heavy, and to feel the pain of another person as if it were her own. This natural gift of empathy inevitably guided her toward medicine. First, she began training as a licensed nurse, studying late into the night while others her age were out at parties. Later, she took on the demanding and unforgiving environment of the emergency room. The work was grueling, long shifts that stretched into double overtimes, endless stress, unpredictable cases. But Alex never once complained to anyone. She believed, almost with a sense of destiny, that her role was to be present precisely at the moments when others were falling apart. She used to say, "When people feel their worst, that's when I should be at my best." Alex was born and raised in Minnesota. Her childhood unfolded in a modest suburban home in St. Paul, where she lived with her father, her mother, and her younger brother. They were, by all accounts, an ordinary American middle-class family. Yet life in their home carried its own quiet challenges. Both parents worked long hours, often coming home late and exhausted. From her teenage years, Alex assumed the role of caregiver for her brother, preparing meals, helping with homework, and even attending parent-teacher meetings when her parents couldn't. It was during those formative years that her defining qualities began to crystallize. A deep sense of responsibility, an almost stubborn reserve, and a learned instinct never to show weakness no matter the burden she carried. By the time she reached high school, Alex already knew what her future path would look like. She wanted medicine, not because of money or prestige, but because she longed to be useful, to matter in the most concrete way possible. For a time, she even considered training as a paramedic, drawn to the immediacy of helping people at the most critical moments of their lives. After finishing college, she secured a position at a local clinic. Within months, she earned the trust and admiration of colleagues, some of whom had been in the profession for decades. Alex wasn't simply the new nurse. She became a person everyone came to for advice, for reassurance, for a steady hand in chaotic moments. She embodied responsibility, composure, and strength. But as is often the case with those who spend their lives caring for others, Alex carried her own pain quietly. She rarely spoke about her personal struggles, even to close friends. They knew only fragments, that she had experienced a series of difficult relationships, some ending abruptly, one leaving her especially scarred. Outwardly, she kept moving forward, always the reliable one, always composed. Yet beneath that exterior, there were battles unseen. By her early 30s, Alex had weathered more than most people realize. She endured emotional burnout and, for a time, fell into dependency on prescription medication, a silent struggle that almost derailed her career. Therapy became a lifeline, a place where she tried to rediscover herself, brick by brick. These were dark chapters, but Alex faced them with the same determination she showed in her work. To many, it seemed as though she had overcome those storms. Her family recalled that by the end of 2022, Alex seemed to have entered a new, more hopeful chapter. She had finally moved into her own apartment, decorating it with simple but warm touches that reflected her personality. She worked hard at the clinic, and in her free time she had started going to yoga classes, rediscovering small rituals of care for herself. She began laughing again, not the polite, restrained laughter of someone performing strength for others, but genuine, unguarded laughter. For the first time in a long while, she appeared lighter, freer, as if life were offering her a chance to breathe again. And yet, as is often true in stories like hers, what could be seen on the surface was only part of the picture. Behind her outward well-being, behind the calm smiles and reassuring words, there were still currents running quietly beneath. Few people noticed, fewer still understood. Around this time, Alex began a new relationship with a man named Matthew Ecker. He was older than Alex, a physician assistant who worked at a hospital not far from where she spent her long shifts. Their paths first crossed not in some dramatic encounter, but in the almost mundane setting of an inter-hospital medical conference. It was a professional gathering, sterile, structured, filled with discussions of patient care, new practices, and the ever-present problem of overworked staff. Yet, in the middle of that routine atmosphere, Alex and Matthew found themselves in quiet conversation. What began as casual remarks about the endless late nights and the mental toll of working in medicine soon deepened into something more personal. They were two people who, at least outwardly, seemed to understand the unique kind of exhaustion that comes from holding the weight of other people's suffering. The connection between them was subtle at first, but grew steadily. To friends looking from the outside, it appeared cautious, almost secretive. It was not that either of them seemed ashamed of the relationship. Rather, they both instinctively avoided publicity. Alex had always been private when it came to her personal life. She disliked oversharing, believing that the most intimate things should not be displayed for the world to see. And Matthew was guarded by nature. He carried an aura of distance, as though there was always a part of him closed off. Few people could claim to know him well. At work, however, Matthew's reputation was solid. His colleagues described him as professional, punctual, and always neatly dressed. He had the ability to speak with authority and charm, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who was fully in control. To many, he was the kind of person who made an impression quickly, articulate, self-assured, always ready with the right words. This same quality seemed to draw Alex in. After years of personal chaos and uncertainty, the image of stability Matthew projected must have felt reassuring, even magnetic. Yet beneath the polished surface, there was a haze of unanswered questions. His past was rarely spoken of in detail. What people whispered about him was fragmented. Rumors of a difficult divorce, hints that he had children he rarely saw, and suggestions that there had once been complaints about his behavior at work. But there were no facts, no official record that anyone could point to. only murmurs in hallways and unfinished sentences at lunch tables. This gave him a mysterious edge, one that intrigued some but left others unsettled. As the months went by, Alex began to notice cracks in the picture she had first believed. Subtle signs emerged, and they did not go unnoticed by her closest friends. Matthew began to show behaviors that were less about care and more about control. He asked who she was texting, wanted to know where she was at every moment, and kept track of when she was online. What might have seemed like concern at first slowly took on another tone, one that made Alex question herself. On more than one occasion, she confessed to her friends that he could suddenly change his mood. Sometimes he became cold, distant, almost detached, as if shutting her out completely. Other times, without warning, he would flare up, reacting with an intensity that caught her off guard. These unpredictable shifts left Alex unsettled. She began to wonder, was she still truly herself in this relationship, or was she molding her own behavior just to avoid confrontation? Still, Alex hesitated. She had always been someone who believed in giving people chances, second chances, sometimes even third. Her empathy, the same quality that made her an exceptional nurse, also made it difficult for her to walk away. She wanted to believe that people could change, that difficult moments did not define the entirety of a person. Friends worried that this generosity, this insistence on seeing the best in others, sometimes came at her own expense. By the autumn of 2022, the doubts in her mind were growing heavier. Then, in November, something shifted. Alex met someone new, a man named Shane Anderson. Unlike Matthew, Shane was not part of the medical field. She felt lighter with him, and perhaps began to believe that she could leave the old, painful relationship. But she did not tell Matthew right away. Perhaps she did not want a conflict. Perhaps she hoped that everything would resolve itself. But nothing resolved. On the contrary, everything began to rapidly escalate. On December 15th, 2022, Alex, Matthew, and Shane found themselves in a bar. A chance meeting that would turn out to be the starting point. Security cameras showed Shane approaching the couple, engaging in conversation, and then a fight. Shane punched Matthew, after which he was escorted out of the establishment. Alex looked agitated, but stayed with Matthew. After the fight, Alex couldn't come to her senses for several minutes. She stood at the bar and seemed to be trying to decide something for herself. Matthew, despite the blow he received, showed neither aggression nor shock. He silently drank water and watched her. Several patrons turned around, discussing the situation, but the couple seemed not to notice anyone else. The bartender later recalled that Alex looked not so much confused as internally crushed. She returned to the table and tried to call someone, but seeing Matthew's look, she put the phone away. Their conversation at the table was short, restrained, as if they were both afraid to say something unnecessary. At 42, cameras recorded them leaving the bar. She one step ahead, he following with his hands in his pockets. In the parking lot, they stopped at her car, and an argument broke out between them. Alex was gesturing, proving something, and Matthew stood almost motionless. A couple of minutes later, the argument stopped, and they drove together towards her house. On the way, Alex wrote a short message to her friend. "He's silent again. He's pressuring." This was not the first alarming message related to Matthew in recent weeks. Alex shared with her friends that he had become unpredictable and that she felt glued to the wall. Upon arrival home, they did not immediately enter the apartment. They spent about 10 minutes in the car. One of the neighbors later reported that he saw them standing at the entrance and Alex lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. There were no longer loud conversations between them in the apartment, but the atmosphere was tense. Alex turned on music in the bedroom, as if trying to create at least some background music to drown out her internal anxiety. Matthew went into the kitchen, poured himself some water, and stood by the window for a long time without moving. He didn't say a word, but his gaze was heavy, as if he already knew something. That night, everything that had been unsaid over the past months hung between them. A thick, almost tangible silence. December 16th, 2022. Minnesota. The streets were still breathing the pre-dawn silence. It was about 5:30 in the morning when the duty station received a call. The man's voice on the line sounded tense, but there were no obvious signs of panic. He introduced himself, Matthew Ecker. He said that he was in the apartment of his girlfriend, Alexandra Pennig, that he heard a gunshot and that he was trying to open the door. The operator asked the standard questions. Where are you? What happened? But Ecker couldn't give a clear answer to many of them. He was confused in his wording. He said that she locked herself in the bathroom, that he broke down the door, and that there was a gun next to her, his own. A few minutes later, police and paramedics arrived at the specified address. It was an ordinary, unremarkable apartment in a multi-apartment building. Silence behind the door. Inside, dim lighting, an uncleaned kitchen, signs that the night had been long. On the bathroom floor lay a woman. She was already dead. Experienced officers immediately sensed that something didn't add up in this picture. First, the dried DNA. This meant that death had not occurred a minute before the call. Probably an hour, maybe more, before the police arrived. However, Ecker claimed that he had heard the gunshot only recently. The time frame did not match. Secondly, Matthew himself. When he was questioned at the scene, he behaved. Strangely. Not hysterical. Not crazy. But reserved, even cool. He said that the gun belonged to him, was kept in the car, but that he had taken it to the apartment that night, just in case. He said that Alex was upset, that after an argument at the bar, she had withdrawn into herself. He said that he tried to calm her down, but she suddenly went into the bathroom and locked the door. The officers carefully examined the scene, and here more details appeared that raised doubts. On the inside of the lock of the bathroom door, there was a small metal ring, the latch mechanism. It was lying under Alex's body. This was impossible if the door was really locked and it was opened after the shot. The only logical conclusion, the door was open until the moment of death. So Matthew's version was falling apart. There was no water on the sink. Although Ecker claimed that after breaking down the door, he washed his hands of blood, the sink was dry. No traces of water, no drops on the floor. And that meant he was lying. The bathroom itself looked atypical. Firstly, the position of the body. Secondly, the position of the gun. The gun was lying next to the body, but not in the way it usually falls from the hand. It was neatly lying to the left of her, although Alex was right-handed. Moreover, there were no traces of a shot at close range. No traces of soot on the palms. No characteristic burns that appear when shooting at close range. The gun, in fact, seemed to end up next to her, but not as a result of a natural fall. The forensic scientist began to photograph every corner, every detail. From that moment on, the case ceased to be routine. It became criminal. Matthew was taken away for questioning, not as an accused, just as a witness. He still stuck to his story, that they had returned from the bar at about 1 a.m. Alex was depressed. He tried to calm her down, but she was becoming more and more withdrawn. He claimed that he hadn't expected a tragedy, but then he heard a gunshot. Then he broke down the door and saw what he saw. But the investigators already knew. His story was a patchwork quilt, tight in places, but with holes that couldn't be ignored. He claimed that Alex had started acting strange at home, talking about being scared. Allegedly, she was worried that Shane was a danger. Matthew said that he had offered to stay with her. He went to the car, got the gun, and, in his words, just in case, brought it into the apartment. This moment attracted special attention from the investigators. Why would a man who claimed that his girlfriend was unstable bring a loaded gun into the house? Why would he, a medical professional with experience, decide that a gun was appropriate? Why didn't he call the police if he said he was afraid for her safety? These whys piled up like a snowball. Next is his claim that Alex locked herself in the bathroom and refused to talk. He says that after some time he heard a gunshot, that he broke down the door, that it was too late. But the forensics experts already knew. The door was broken down before the moment of death, that he spent hours in the apartment next to the body, not calling for help, and possibly hiding something. Traces of DNA, fingerprints were seized at the scene, and measurements of the shot's trajectory were taken. According to ballistics, the shot was fired from a distance exceeding the length of an outstretched arm. That is, the shot was not self-inflicted. Moreover, the direction of the trajectory, from top to bottom at an angle. Ecker at this point continued to insist. He had done nothing. It was a tragedy. He had loved her. He had tried to help her. He had said that she had been broken after the bar fight, that she had spoken of fear, of shame. But the further the investigation went, the clearer it became. The truth was quite different. On the second day of the investigation, surveillance cameras were examined, both in the bar and on the street near the house. Something strange arose. It took more than 40 minutes to get home, while the journey to the apartment usually takes no more than 15. This was not enough time. Alex's phone was active during this period, but no calls were made from it. Only opening a messenger, then turning off the screen. One of the digital trace experts would later say, "They tried to unlock the phone, but without success. 3 false attempts." Alex's friends were questioned in the first days. They told about strange correspondence, disturbing voice messages. The correspondence between Alex and her friends spoke for themselves. She wrote that she doubted her relationship with Matthew, that he was jealous, that she felt as if he was looking through her, not at her. In one message sent a week before the tragedy, she wrote, "I don't feel safe with him, but I'm not ready to break things off yet. He can be very persuasive." In another, she admitted, "I think he's following me. I'm not paranoid. It's just that there are little things you can't help but notice." One fragment of the correspondence was especially important. "He doesn't scream, he just turns off my air." Alex left this message just a day before the fateful night. Forensic experts also examined Matthew's car. In the glove compartment, they found a printout of their correspondence underlined with a marker. In the trunk, there were fabric gloves and a tightly folded jacket with a flash drive in the pocket. Later, an examination would show that the flash drive contained an audio file, a recording of Alex's voice, most likely recorded without her knowledge. What exactly was on it was not included in the case. The lawyers managed to exclude this evidence from the protocol, citing a violation of privacy. Nevertheless, the investigation continued to piece together the puzzle. Alex had not updated her social media posts for 2 days before the tragedy, which was unusual. Her stories were deleted, as it turned out, manually, and from her device. But at a late time, when, according to experts, she was already asleep. This gave reason to believe that someone else had access to her phone. Matthew, of course, denied this. A psychological examination of the couple revealed important details. Matthew was characterized as restrained, prone to passive aggression, with a pronounced desire for control. His behavior was described as emotionally detached, but strategically calibrated. All this, coupled with inconsistent testimony, alerted investigators. 2 weeks later, the case went from a tragic incident to a criminal investigation. The official motive had not yet been announced, but the prosecutor's office was already preparing to bring charges. Everyone was waiting for only one thing: the forensic report. It turned out to be a turning point. When the experts announced the results of the ballistic and trace examinations, the investigation finally received the crack in Matthew's version that allowed them to look deeper. The bullet entered at an unusual angle, from top to bottom, with an unusual trajectory for a self-inflicted shot. Moreover, the trace of the shot was not typical for a close range, as Matthew claimed. The forensic experts recreated the scene to the nearest centimeter. They used a mannequin similar in height and build to Alex, recreated the lighting, the arrangement of objects. The results did not favor the suspect's version. The position of the body, the distribution of spatter, the angle of the entry wound. Everything pointed to an external influence. One of the investigators said in an interview, "We had a feeling that we were not dealing with an impulsive act. It looked like something thought out, almost theatrical." An important element was the analysis of Matthew's behavior for 2 weeks after the tragedy. He refused to comment publicly, did not contact Alex's friends, and completely isolated himself. During interrogations, he answered questions, but showed almost no emotion. Psychologists who observed him noted a low level of effective reaction, which is considered an alarming signal in such situations. At the same time, investigators began working with digital evidence. They recovered data from Matthew's laptop and tablet. The browser history contains dozens of requests related to manipulation methods, forms of psychological pressure, and the specifics of lie detectors. 3 weeks before the incident, he searched for articles with the titles, "How to Recognize Treason by Nonverbal Signs," and "What to Do if You Have Been Betrayed." This data was included in the case as possible confirmation of motives. In addition, it became known that Matthew, a few days before the incident, submitted a request to delete Alex's account on one of the medical portals, where she stored information about an upcoming promotion. When asked about the reasons, he replied, "I just wanted to protect her." But from what? He did not specify. Alex's friends talked about a strange incident on the eve of the tragedy. At a group dinner, she seemed afraid to leave her phone unattended. One of the girls recalled, "She kept it in her hand, even in the bathroom. She said that Matthew had become too intrusive, but she was afraid to anger him." These phrases began to acquire new weight. Particular attention was drawn to that very 9-minute interval between the gunshot and the call to 911. One of the forensic experts said, "In cases like this, every second counts. If he was really trying to help, then the call would have been immediate." At the request of the prosecutor's office, a simulation was conducted. Even with shock and panic, a person in the same apartment could have called within 40 seconds. 9 minutes is too long. The investigation was faced with a lack of direct witnesses. But circumstantial evidence began to form a chain. Among the evidence was a note found in Alex's diary. Handwritten, undated, it contained one phrase: "If something happens to me, it won't be me." An examination confirmed the authenticity of the handwriting. For the prosecutor's office, this was enough to initiate a review of the case status and request an arrest warrant. At the end of January 2023, Matthew Ecker was officially arrested on suspicion of involvement in the death of Alex Penning. He was charged with manslaughter with aggravating circumstances, including pressure on the victim, concealment of evidence, and giving false testimony. This was a turning point. From tragedy to criminal case. From suspicion to accusation. But everything that remained outside the evidence, feelings, hints, fears, tension between the lines, now had to be heard in court. On May 15, 2023, the Hennepin County courtroom began the trial of the state versus Matthew Ecker. This was not just a trial about a personal tragedy. It was a trial about silence that accumulates over the years, becomes heavy as concrete, and at some point, collapses on the heads of everyone who was nearby. Matthew appeared before the court as a defendant. He was charged with a crime with aggravating circumstances, intentional psychological pressure, concealment of important details, untimely appeal for help. The wording was dry and legalistic, but behind them were months of tension, unbearable closeness, words that were not said, and those that were spoken too late. At the first hearing, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Present were not only representatives of the press and Alex's loved ones, but also ordinary people who were struck by the story itself. Their faces reflected distrust, fear, and for some, a vague hope that the truth would finally be heard. The judge made it clear right away. Emotions would not be the basis of the trial. Only facts, only evidence. But in this case, the facts were not always obvious, and the truth did not always succumb to logic. The prosecution built the case methodically. Their strategy was simple: to show a chain of consistent actions indicating a systemic psychological impact, which, according to the prosecution, led to the tragedy. The main emphasis was not on the moment of the incident, but on the months preceding it. Digital correspondence, diary entries, testimonies of Alex's friends and colleagues. All this formed the basis of the prosecution's line of evidence. Several of her messages to friends were read out in court. "He looks, but says nothing. It's worse than screaming. I feel like I'm walking on glass. If I could just disappear, I would disappear." Each phrase sounded like a separate cry for help, archived in a chat. The prosecutor called it a silent diary of fear. On the third day, the court called its first witness, Carly, a close friend of Alex. She looked composed, but her hands were shaking. When asked to talk about the last weeks of her friend's life, she remained silent for a long time. She stopped laughing, Carly finally said. She used to have this sparkling laugh. And then, nothing. She looked out the window, held her phone like a shield. She said he was different. I didn't know what it meant until it was too late. The defense lawyers did not deny the difficulties in the couple's relationship, but insisted that the incident was a tragic coincidence, the result of an emotional breakdown on both sides. They tried to portray Alex as a person going through an internal crisis, and Matthew as a man in a difficult situation, unable to cope. But this version began to crumble at the seams when a digital security expert was called into the courtroom. The specialist said that search queries dated 10 days before the tragedy were found on Matthew's tablet. Among them were how to read other people's correspondence without access to the password, what to do if a girl hides correspondence, the psychology of jealousy, and how to understand that you have been betrayed. The judge allowed some of this data to be shown to the jury. The tension in the courtroom increased. These were not just curious queries. These were attempts at control. Later, one of the witnesses, a former colleague of Matthew, said that he often complained about Alex's detachment. He said that she seemed to be slipping away, that there was less warmth in her. I then thought, a common story. But now, zrenia, gola svedetele treshel. On the sixth day, the court heard an audio recording made by Alex 2 weeks before the tragedy. It was a background recording from a dictaphone, possibly accidental. It contains a conversation. Alex speaks quietly, excitedly. I don't know what to do with you anymore. You are silent all the time, disappearing. It is as if I live with a shadow. Matthew's answer was inaudible. Only silence, the sound of movement around the room and a heavy breath. This recording became the emotional peak of the hearing. Several people in the room were crying. One of the jurors looked away. When it was the turn of the defense, they tried to return the trial to the realm of facts, not emotions. 2 psychiatrists were invited to analyze Alex's emotional state. One of them concluded that she could have had an acute stress reaction and a borderline state. The prosecutor immediately demanded that these conclusions be excluded as hypothetical. The judge allowed them, but with the proviso that they were not a medical diagnosis. The lawyers also referred to the lack of direct witnesses. They reminded that no one saw what happened inside the apartment that night. All the evidence was circumstantial, but it is in cases like these, as the prosecutor emphasized, that everything comes together from details, like a mosaic. He took the jury through the chronology, the parking lot camera, the argument by the car, the text messages on the way, the behavior at the bar, her note, "If something happens to me, it won't be me." Alex's family spoke on the 7th day. Her brother, briefly and almost emotionlessly, said, "She wanted to leave." He knew. We all knew. But we didn't know what he was capable of. The father's words were restrained, almost legalistic. My daughter deserved her freedom. She tried to break free, but she fell into a trap that is not visible from the outside. This is not a story about a loud conflict. This is a story about silence that weighs down. After 8 days of hearings, the jury retired to consider its verdict. The room held its breath. For 13 hours, they analyzed materials, compared testimony, rewatched fragments of audio recordings and video surveillance. The judge forbade journalists from approaching the deliberation room. The anticipation was tense. The next day, shortly after noon, the jury returned. The verdict was announced in a silence in which no one in the courtroom seemed to be breathing. Guilty of count 2, aggravated felony. In February 2024, Matthew was sentenced to 30 years in prison. On October 8th, 2019, Mangi was at home, caring for her child. She texted a friend in the evening and did not mention anything unusual. The next morning, Joseph Elledge told police that she was gone. Vanished, he claimed, sometime overnight. He sounded calm, flat. He told the dispatcher that when he woke up that morning, his wife wasn't in the bed. He assumed she'd gone out for a walk, but she hadn't returned. Her car was in the garage. Her phone sat on the kitchen table. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, just absence. Mangi Gi, born in 1991 in the city of Xi'an, in China's Shanxi province, known more for its ancient terracotta army than for modern scandal. Her parents were educators. Her mother taught literature at a secondary school, while her father was a retired university administrator who instilled in Mangi Gi a love for order, books, and introspection. They were not wealthy, but their household was filled with quiet encouragement and structured days. Education was her birthright, her religion, and her passport to a better life. Raised in a modest but nurturing family, Mangi Gi's early years were shaped by strong values of education and perseverance. Quiet, but quietly luminous, she led a life that, from the outside, seemed well-composed, steady, and deeply rooted in discipline and personal integrity. From a young age, she exhibited a hunger for knowledge, excelling academically, and dreaming of opportunities that stretched beyond the boundaries of her hometown. Not the type of child who chattered or made mischief, she preferred solitude, pages, and a sense of purpose. Her academic record was pristine. Her teachers recalled her as that rare student who needed no supervision, just a little sunlight and a lot of silence. She was not a recluse, though. She played piano, she danced, ballet, then traditional Chinese dance. Her classmates liked her, but she had that quiet barrier, the one that polite girls with sharp minds often erect. A wall not of arrogance, but of self-containment. Like many ambitious students, she set her sights on the United States as a place where her aspirations could find fertile ground. The decision to leave home was not made lightly. It meant embracing uncertainty, cultural dissonance, and the challenge of carving out a new identity in an unfamiliar world. In 2012, Mangi Gi arrived in the United States to pursue a master's degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering at the University of Missouri. Arriving at the University of Missouri as a graduate student, Mangi Gi quickly established herself as a dedicated scholar. Her peers and professors described her as intelligent, polite, and quietly ambitious. She pursued her studies with focus, intent on laying the groundwork for a successful career. For Mangi Gi, the University of Missouri was more than just an institution. It was the gateway to a new chapter, a place where ambition met possibility. But beyond academics, Mangi Gi was also adjusting to a new life, navigating language barriers, cultural expectations, and the isolation that can shadow international students. Despite these challenges, she remained committed to building a life that balanced personal growth with the deep ties she maintained to her family and heritage. Mangi Gi was known among her peers as diligent, kind-hearted, and deeply devoted to her family back home. She often spoke of her dreams not just in terms of academic achievement, but of building a safe, loving environment where her future child could thrive. Yet beneath her composed exterior was a woman driven by hope, balancing the pressures of a demanding academic schedule with the simple human desire for connection and belonging. By 2014, she had completed her master's degree and decided to stay in Missouri, accepting a job as a researcher at a local engineering firm. Her work focused on computational modeling and materials testing. Dry, precise, but exactly the kind of thing that appealed to her mind. There was no dramatic ambition, no hunger for status. What she wanted was control over her time, her environment, her future. And for a while, she seemed to have it. It was during this postgraduate period that she met Joseph Elledge, an engineering student 2 years her junior at Mizzou. He was American, born and raised in Missouri, and compared to Mangi Gi, he was extroverted, confident, and energetic. The two met through a university event. It was, by many accounts, an unlikely match. He was more boisterous, more casual, but he was intelligent and ambitious, and he made her laugh. Those who saw them together described a surprising chemistry. She softened his edges, and he gave her a kind of social ease she'd never prioritized before. Their courtship wasn't whirlwind, but it was earnest. Over time, they grew close. They shared a background in engineering, a mutual respect for intellect, and a similar commitment to future stability. They both wanted children, a house, a life with predictability. Joseph, despite his sometimes sarcastic exterior, reportedly spoke about Mangi with admiration. He described her as incredibly driven, way smarter than me, and called her his anchor. They married in 2017 in a small courthouse ceremony, attended by a few close friends and colleagues. Mangi gave birth to their daughter in 2018. The baby, whose name was kept mostly private out of respect for family privacy, became the center of Mangi's world. She took a leave from her job and devoted herself to motherhood with the same discipline and quiet fervor she had applied to everything else in her life. But motherhood also seemed to open her in new ways. Friends noticed a softness to her, a new warmth. She was someone striving to create a nurturing home that blended her Chinese roots with her new American reality. However, beneath the surface, cracks began to form in the facade of a happy family. Those close to Mangi noticed subtle changes. Her enthusiasm dimmed, her smile less frequent, and her social interactions more guarded. Her once strong spirit seemed weighed down by something unseen. A troubling dynamic developed, marked by emotional tension and control. Though Mangi rarely spoke about the troubles she faced at home, those who cared for her began to suspect that her marriage was far from the fairy tale it appeared to be. It became apparent that Joseph wielded influence not just as a spouse, but as a figure of authority whose behavior grew increasingly domineering. Cultural differences, often a bridge in diverse relationships, became a source of tension. He allegedly used Mangi's immigration status as leverage, threatening deportation and isolating her from friends and support systems. This control cast a long shadow over Mangi's daily life. The very hopes that had brought her to America were now entangled in fear and uncertainty. The power imbalance within the relationship left her vulnerable, caught between the desire to protect her daughter and the growing need to escape. In conversations with a few trusted confidants, Mangi expressed her wish to return to China and seek a safer, freer life for herself and her child. Yet, the path to freedom was fraught with legal, emotional, and cultural obstacles that complicated every step. She did not tell her parents the full extent of her doubts, but she did begin to prepare for possibilities. She inquired, quietly, about returning to work. She began applying to jobs in other states. And critically, she created a folder on her private drive labeled Emergency Personal. Inside were financial documents, journal entries, and screenshots of text messages. It was not a panic move. It was preparation. On October 8th, 2019, Mangi was at home, caring for her child. She texted a friend in the evening and did not mention anything unusual. The next morning, Joseph Elledge told police that she was gone. Vanished, he claimed, sometime overnight. He sounded calm, flat. He told the dispatcher that when he woke up that morning, his wife wasn't in the bed. He assumed she'd gone out for a walk, but she hadn't returned. Her car was in the garage. Her phone sat on the kitchen table. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, just absence. The first officers on the scene noted Joseph's composed demeanor. He offered what details he could, said they'd had an argument the night before, but nothing serious. He described Mangi as quiet, reserved, someone who could keep things bottled up. He speculated that perhaps she needed space. When officers asked if there were any places she might go, friends' houses, parks, a retreat, he shrugged. She didn't really talk to people, he said. That line stuck with them. Within 48 hours, Colombia police classified Mangi Gi as a missing adult under suspicious circumstances. To those who knew Mangi, that story never made sense. She wasn't impulsive. She wouldn't have left her child, and she certainly wouldn't have disappeared without telling someone. Not Mangi, not the woman who scheduled her grocery trips, who made digital backups of her recipe notes, who kept her books arranged by subject and language. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, reviewed traffic and surveillance cameras, checked nearby parks, and interviewed friends and family. They looked at Joseph first, not because they had immediate proof, but because they always look at the spouse first. It's a brutal truth in homicide investigation. When a woman vanishes, The man closest to her is statistically the most likely answer. Not always, but often. And Joseph Elledge, cool, polite, but somehow disengaged, fit a familiar pattern. Then they found Mangi Gi's journal. It was on a cloud server, buried under several file directories. It hadn't been accessed since early October. Her digital diary, written almost entirely in Mandarin, painted a picture that sharply contradicted Joseph's story. In entry after entry, Mangi Gi chronicled growing fear. Not just frustration, but anxiety. She suspected her husband was cheating. She noted changes in his behavior: hostility, disdain, emotional cruelty. She even documented odd things. Joseph locking doors at night unnecessarily, obsessing over surveillance footage from their home camera system, and refusing to let her speak privately with family in China. The home itself, where Mangi Gi was last seen alive, revealed signs of a struggle: disturbed furniture, subtle traces of a scuffle, and items out of place. The quiet certainty that Mangi Gi had simply walked away began to fade, replaced by a mounting suspicion that something far more sinister had occurred. And Joseph's story was unraveling. Police began cross-referencing his location data. On the morning after Mangi Gi disappeared, Joseph had reportedly stayed home. But his phone, combined with his vehicle's GPS history, told a different story. Just after midnight, in the early hours of October 9th, his car had taken a long, wandering trip north, deep into the wooded stretches of Boone County. The route made no logical sense. No gas stations, no emergency calls, just a drive into nature. For 2 hours. And back. When detectives confronted him about the trip, he faltered. First, he claimed he couldn't remember. Then, he said he was clearing his head. Then, he said maybe he'd just driven aimlessly and gotten lost. When asked why he didn't mention the trip earlier, he blamed forgetfulness. His voice, normally steady, cracked slightly under pressure. He kept saying the same thing. "I didn't hurt her. I don't know where she went." Police didn't believe him. But without a body, they had little to charge him with. What they did have, however, were other concerns. In reviewing digital material from Joseph's devices, they discovered something else: deeply troubling audio recordings. Joseph, it turned out, had been secretly recording his arguments with Mangi Gi. In one of the clips, he berates her in a low, angry tone. The transcript later entered into court documents reads like a litany of emotional abuse. Accusations, mockery, veiled threats. At one point, he tells her, "You'll never leave. You don't have anywhere to go." In another, "You don't matter as much as you think." Prosecutors moved quickly, not for murder, but for child endangerment. It was a tactical decision. If they couldn't prove murder yet, they could hold him long enough to keep digging. And they kept digging. Weeks turned to months. Volunteers searched the woods. Rivers were combed. No sign of Mangi Gi. But in the background, digital forensic experts were building a map, an invisible trail drawn from metadata, drive logs, and pattern recognition. They believed Joseph had returned to the same wooded area more than once. They began narrowing the search. In a case that would captivate forensic experts and true crime enthusiasts alike, investigators found an unusual but decisive clue: traces of juniper-3 needles on Joseph's boots. While seemingly innocuous, these botanical remnants were the key to piecing together Mangi Gi's final moments. The needles matched a specific tree near a remote section of Rockbridge Memorial State Park, a location not far from Columbia, but isolated enough to suggest a deliberate effort to conceal a crime. Then came March 25th, 2020. A hiker in Rockbridge Memorial State Park, a vast expanse of forest, limestone caves, and shallow creeks, spotted something out of place. A shallow grave. Bones. Police were called. Forensics arrived. The body was intact enough for identification. A dental match confirmed it. Mangi Gi had been found. Her remains had been buried in a remote wooded section of the park, an area Joseph had driven near on the very night she disappeared. The autopsy revealed chilling truths. There were no obvious signs of gunshot wounds or stabbing. but Mengi's neck vertebrae showed evidence of trauma consistent with strangulation. The circumstances surrounding the discovery raised immediate questions. Why had Mengi's body been hidden in such a remote location? Who was responsible for her death? And how had such a devastating crime gone unnoticed for so long in a small college town? These questions fueled a sense of urgency among law enforcement, while the community grappled with shock and sorrow. The young woman once seen as a symbol of hope was now a victim of a brutal and clandestine act. Investigators quickly began to piece together the events leading up to her death, uncovering a disturbing narrative of control, fear, and ultimately, violence. The site where her body was found was not a random location, but appeared to be deliberately chosen for concealment. This pointed toward a calculated attempt to hide the crime, reflecting a chilling awareness on the part of the perpetrator. The physical evidence at the scene, combined with forensic analysis, suggested that Mengi had suffered end, contradicting any notion of accidental death. Advocacy groups and community leaders used the case as a stark reminder of the importance of support systems and early intervention in abusive relationships, especially for immigrants who may face additional barriers. In the days following the discovery, the media coverage intensified, shining a spotlight on the tragic fate of a young woman who had once been full of promise. Mengi's death became a somber symbol of the hidden struggles faced by countless victims, underscoring the need for awareness, education, and justice. While grief overwhelmed those who loved her, the discovery also set in motion a rigorous investigation aimed at uncovering the truth. Law enforcement agencies mobilized, working to gather evidence, interview witnesses, and build a case that could hold the perpetrator accountable. Every detail, from forensic traces at the burial site to phone records and witness accounts, was scrutinized to reconstruct Mengi's final hours and identify those responsible. The confirmation of Mangi Gi's death transformed a community's concern into a determined quest for justice. It was clear that the story behind her disappearance was far from over. The timeline of Joseph's movements was reconstructed through phone records, surveillance footage, and witness testimonies, each piece narrowing the window of time in which the crime occurred. The painstaking accumulation of evidence left little room for doubt. Mangi Gi had been murdered, and Joseph Elledge was responsible. To fully understand how Mangi Gi's husband became the prime suspect in her murder, investigators had to go backward, before the discovery of her body. If the search for Mangi had been about where she went, the next phase was about why, and how she ended up buried beneath soil and brush in Rockbridge Memorial State Park. For that, detectives turned to the one person who could explain the collapse of that quiet, orderly life: Joseph Elledge. In public, Joseph was cooperative, at least in the early days. He gave interviews, he answered police questions, he spoke about Mangi as if she were still alive, even as evidence to the contrary piled up. But it wasn't long before his mask began to slip. His statements contradicted themselves. The stories changed. His affect remained curiously flat, even under pressure. There was no desperation in his voice, no frantic energy to bring his wife home. Instead, there was calculation. The investigation into Joseph's behavior began to unearth a disturbing pattern, one less visible in the bright moments of courtship and more evident in the rhythms of married life. In addition to the audio files Joseph had recorded himself, many of them surreptitious, detectives also recovered hours of home surveillance footage, personal emails, browser histories, and text messages. From that data, a psychological profile began to emerge, and it wasn't a flattering one. Joseph, who had appeared so affable and composed in public, revealed a darker persona in private. The marriage, investigators found, had been strained from early on. He sought control, and when control eluded him, he became passive-aggressive, then aggressive. This dynamic bled into his relationship with Mangi in disturbing ways. Joseph's secret audio recordings, some of which ran for over an hour, documented arguments where his voice remained low but his language cut deep. He criticized her accent, accused her of being emotionally unavailable, and regularly implied she was a burden. Mangi's response, soft, almost pleading, was difficult to hear. Joseph had isolated Mangi. He controlled her social exposure. He dismissed her cultural identity, made decisions about their daughter without consulting her, and demeaned her ambitions. She had, by the time of her death, become a diminished version of the woman her friends had once known. And there was more, especially concerning Joseph's fidelity. At the time of Mengi's disappearance, Joseph was actively communicating with multiple women online. Digital forensic specialists traced several encrypted messages and image exchanges with women on various apps. Some were flirtatious. One in particular stood out: a sustained conversation with a woman he had met through a dating app in which he described himself as trapped in a marriage that was already over. To investigators, this wasn't just a motive. It was a map, a trail of thought that showed intention, resentment, and the desire to escape a relationship he had come to see as suffocating. When Mengi began pushing for changes, returning to work, gaining financial independence, asserting herself more in parenting decisions, Joseph did not react with compromise. He reacted with escalation. Another damning detail came in the form of search history. In the weeks leading up to October 9th, Joseph had searched topics that included ways to disappear without a trace, decomposition in Missouri, and how long police wait before declaring someone dead. The combination of those queries with the timing, the relationship decay, and the remote GPS data painted a chilling portrait. But perhaps the most haunting piece of evidence was Joseph's behavior in the days immediately following Mengi's disappearance. Instead of participating in search efforts, posting flyers, or engaging the community, he spent his time editing photos of their daughter, watching instructional videos on hiking gear, and transferring money between personal accounts. At one point, he even tried to access Mengi's Chinese bank account using saved credentials. Prosecutors believed Joseph knew exactly what he was doing. That night, after what was likely a final, fatal confrontation, he waited for his daughter to fall asleep. Then he placed Mengi's body in his vehicle, drove for over an hour into the park, and buried her in a shallow grave he'd prepared earlier. The grave was clumsily dug, but carefully chosen. Far enough off trail to avoid foot traffic, but close enough to reach quickly. GPS logs confirmed that he returned to the same location twice in the following weeks, likely to check the burial site and make sure it remained undisturbed. To the outside world, he maintained the image of a calm, confused father. But the digital footprint told a different story. The actions of a man who had rehearsed disappearance, tested boundaries, and erased what didn't fit. As one detective put it later, he didn't kill her because she was his enemy. He killed her because she was no longer his possession. By the time Joseph was formally charged with first-degree murder, the case against him was not built on a single smoking gun, but on the accretion of detail. Minute, damning, and consistent. It was the digital timeline, the emotional degradation, the lies, the affairs, the search history, the absence of grief. Each element alone raised questions. But before the trial began, there was one final twist, one that pushed the case from local tragedy to international concern. Joseph, it turned out, had not only buried his wife, he had also tried to escape the jurisdiction that would hold him accountable. Not through flight at first, but through a quiet plan already in motion. One involving passports, false narratives, and a child whose future was suddenly caught between two countries. Shortly after authorities announced their intent to charge Joseph with murder, he vanished. His disappearance set off alarms within law enforcement agencies, triggering a coordinated manhunt that transcended state lines and soon reached global jurisdictions. The question on everyone's mind was not just where he had gone, but how he had managed to evade capture despite the scrutiny he was under. The circumstances of his flight hinted at careful planning, suggesting he was not acting on impulse but executing a premeditated escape. Federal agencies quickly joined local law enforcement, initiating an intense search that leveraged every tool available, from monitoring financial transactions and communications to tracking travel records. Investigators discovered that Joseph had secured travel documents and purchased tickets to leave the country, confirming fears that he intended to evade the American justice system by seeking refuge abroad. His destination was China, Mengi's homeland, a fact that added a new dimension of complexity to the case. Joseph's flight to China set off a cascade of diplomatic and legal challenges. The United States and China do not have a formal extradition treaty, a critical barrier that complicated efforts to return him to face charges. Without this legal framework, American authorities were reliant on diplomatic negotiations, goodwill, and the cooperation of Chinese officials, none of which could be taken for granted. The case quickly morphed from a straightforward criminal investigation into a transnational legal and political issue. The lack of an extradition treaty meant Joseph could potentially live freely in China, protected from prosecution in the US, unless other mechanisms were employed. Meanwhile, Mangi Gi's family, devastated by loss and now confronted with the elusive fugitive, found themselves thrust into a distressing limbo. Their pursuit of justice was entangled not only in grief, but in the murky waters of international law and diplomacy. The case became a poignant example of how globalized the consequences of personal tragedies have become. Social media and public discourse amplified the story, drawing attention worldwide. Back in Missouri, prosecutors prepared their case in absentia, knowing that any hope of a trial hinged on Joseph's return. They compiled irrefutable evidence, fully aware that the courtroom battle might be delayed indefinitely. Yet this did not deter their resolve to hold him accountable. The public, too, remained vigilant, with community members rallying for justice for Mangi, demanding that legal loopholes not shield a murderer from the consequences of his actions. International law experts began exploring alternative avenues, such as Interpol red notices, to restrict Joseph's movements and pressure Chinese authorities to cooperate. Despite these hurdles, the case maintained momentum. The relentless work of investigators and prosecutors sent a clear message that evading the law is neither easy nor without consequence. Media coverage continued to spotlight the case, keeping public attention alive and underscoring the broader implications for transnational crime and justice. Joseph Elledge's flight from the US not only complicated the legal proceedings, but also added an international dimension to a deeply personal tragedy. As authorities continue to pursue every possible avenue to bring Joseph back to stand trial, the world watches, hoping that one day justice for Mangi Gi will transcend borders and offer closure to a family and community left shattered by loss. The criminal proceedings against Joseph Elledge, once he was finally apprehended and brought back to Missouri, the trial began in November 2021. The trial, delayed by Joseph's flight and subsequent extradition complexities, finally commenced amid intense public scrutiny, media attention, and emotional weight. A courtroom battle to unravel the truth and deliver justice. From the outset, the prosecution's case was grounded in a combination of scientific evidence, testimonial accounts, and digital footprints that told a haunting story of control. Central to the prosecution's argument was the forensic botany analysis. The juniper needles found on Joseph's footwear linked him irrefutably to the remote burial site in Rockbridge Memorial State Park, where Mangi Gi's remains had been discovered. This piece of evidence proved pivotal, transforming what had been circumstantial suspicion into a firm forensic connection. Joseph Elledge's defense team sought to cast doubt on the prosecution's claims, arguing that Mangi Gi's death was accidental, an unintended consequence of a domestic dispute gone tragically wrong. They challenged the reliability of the botanical evidence, questioned the interpretation of the audio recordings, and portrayed Joseph as a grieving husband overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. Joseph himself did not testify. His attorneys believed his calm, flat demeanor might come across as cold, even sociopathic. However, the jury was confronted with a compelling and consistent body of evidence. Medical testimony detailed the injuries found on Mangi Gi's remains, consistent with a violent altercation rather than an accidental death. Witnesses recounted the history of Joseph's controlling behavior. The trial lasted several weeks, each day adding layers of detail to a story that was as tragic as it was instructive. After weeks of testimony, deliberation began. The jurors faced the solemn responsibility of weighing the evidence against the burden of proof, wrestling with the gravity of the decision before them. The hope was that justice for Mangi Gi would serve as a beacon for others trapped in similar situations, encouraging vigilance, support, and intervention. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours. On the morning of November 11th, 2021, the courtroom stood in silence as the verdict was read. Guilty of second-degree murder. The charge surprised some. The prosecution had sought first-degree murder, arguing that Joseph had planned the killing. But the jury, though convinced he had caused Mangi Gi's death, could not unanimously agree on premeditation. Still, the conviction carried significant weight. Joseph faced a sentence of up to life in prison, and public reaction was swift and largely supportive. "He may not have been convicted of first degree," one observer noted, "but he'll never breathe free air again." The jury recommended a 28-year prison sentence, the maximum penalty allowed under Missouri law for the charge. The decision brought a measure of closure to Mengi's family and the community, affirming that the life of a woman stolen by violence would not be forgotten or dismissed.